Hi, I'm Hannon, the host of The Bells I Hear, an audio and video podcast by Mentor Promise that aims to raise awareness about the homelessness crisis in New York City. We'll be diving into the complexities surrounding the issue. Thanks for tuning in. We are very thrilled to have Nick E. Smith here with us today. He's been involved in a multitude of roles that have really advanced housing, justice, and labor laws here in New York City. He's served as the first deputy public advocate. He's also served as a legislative representative beside Bill de Blasio and his administration. And now he's an executive director at Communities Resist, where he's advocating and defending rights for tenants. We would love to just hear about your journey into public service and what has inspired you to pursue advocacy work.
The starting point for me is I'm a policy person. And so in each of my positions, I've tried to figure out, what are the big core problems in those areas and how can we use government to solve them. Primarily, it's been by passing laws and using the city's budget to fund programs. You mentioned the first deputy public advocate. In that role, we helped pass several housing-related laws with, of course, the overall aim of preventing and ending homelessness and also helping to build and preserve housing and to prevent displacement and gentrification, which, by the way, is a very difficult task. One law I'm proudest of is that the office passed what's called a racial impact study, which requires developers to study the possible racial impact of rezoning a particular area in the city in terms of land use. But the meta of all of that is the city and really the country has a huge affordability crisis when it comes to housing and other things, which only exacerbates the homelessness problem, which it is the responsibility of government, relevant advocacy organizations and nonprofits and others to solve these problems. So that's kind of how I got into this work and what led me to the housing stuff. And you did mention my work in the de Blasio administration. My function there was also to help negotiate bills that the city council wanted to pass in the area of housing, homelessness, and public safety. So I have some background in both those lanes, but particularly the housing and homelessness lane as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I did ask this prior, but just to reiterate, like what sort of got you started in public advocacy work? Is it something like a specific moment or person that sort of pushed you into this realm and has kind of stuck you through it throughout all this time, your extensive career?
Yeah, I think a few issues. Obviously, being Black in America has led me to
Yeah,
see some issues.
that'll.
And I remember way back in the early '90s, after the unfortunate beating of Rodney King, there was a riots in Los Angeles, and that's where I lived and I'm from.
Mm,
And so I think that beating and then the resulting riots and the what I would call uprising
mm,
against police brutality really opened my eyes to the issue of racial and other inequities that exist in the country, and they haven't gone away. In fact, in some ways, they've gotten worse.
mm-hmm.
I know exactly what it's like to wonder where the rent money is going to come from to have a place to live, and I think, as we all know, housing is foundational, and without safe, secure, affordable housing, it's hard to deal with other issues like childcare, etc., healthcare, those kind of things. So that was the beginning for me. Um, I began to, in my own way, identify and solve some of those problems when I went to college. I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad and I studied political science. I went to a political meeting on campus and one of the local city council members showed up. His name is Chris Worthington. And he actually mentioned the issue of housing. And believe it or not, we learned that the school had a problem adequately housing all the students. So the city itself was about 135,000 residents back then, and the school takes up 30,000 of those the population.
Mm,
And so he mentioned a crazy story, which I'll never forget. He said,
mm.
"Yeah, there's students who are here and priced out, and some of them end up living in the subway stations temporarily until they find housing." I thought that was insane.
Wow.
And I saw some of those exact stories in the local newspapers, and I just wondered what like that. This seems to be impossible in a country,
Right.
in a state, and in a city as wealthy as the United States of America, California, and the city of Berkeley. This seems insane, but it was true.
Yeah.
So during college, I ended up joining two policy making bodies there One was the Housing Commission and one was the Labor Commission. And as a housing commissioner, one of I think 8 or 9, and it was a volunteer position. My job though was to uh, study and assess the housing dollars that came in from the federal government
Mm.
for those wonks. It's called CDBG, uh, Community Development Block Grants. Those monies, we were tasked with figuring out how to cut up and spend on housing projects in the city, and also we acted as a dispute resolution center for landlords and tenants who had disputes. So if there was an issue with the quality of the unit or rent payments, there the housing commission was the body that reviewed those things.
Mm.
Very, very, very different from the city of New York, where I eventually moved for law school, and then before, during and after law school, I knew that policy would be where I would go. So I had loved some of the results we had gotten there in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Came to New York and knew that I would want to continue in this kind of work.
Wow. That sounds like just an incredible journey. Like it seems like even that story about just students sleeping like on the subway, like that stuck with you for a very long time.
Hmm.
And I feel like it is one of those like moments where you're just kind of like, how is this an issue, especially in a country that is so incredibly rich and can actually address these issues? And like affordable housing definitely seems to be like the main um, issue and perpetrator, especially here in New York City. Right now, you are executive director at Communities Resist, and
Hmm.
you're kind of doing work to defend tenants. And so, how is Communities Resist tackling or preventing homelessness within our city's most vulnerable populations?
CORE, as it's known, it's just the acronym, was founded in about 5 years ago with the mission not just of representing tenants in housing court, but really focusing specifically on preventing displacement, specifically among low income New Yorkers.
Mm.
And so there's not a day that goes by that we don't hear a story of low income tenant being evicted from their unit because of, I mean, it could be many reasons. The rent went up too much money, so the families can't afford the rent.
Yeah.
Conditions are just uninhabitable, or things like, some larger bad actor landlords seeing these apartments in people's homes as profit centers and needing to push them out if there's something like a rent regulation, which prevents them from charging what they call market rate or higher rents for these units.
Mhm.
There's always upward pressure on people to leave their homes where they raise their children and families because, uh, the rents just keep going up. I think the average rent in Manhattan is for a one bedroom apartment is $3,500 a month,
Yeah.
approaching 4,000 plus a month for a one or two bedroom apartment, where the average wage has not remotely kept up with the increase in rent that we see. And I will just add that the city has a apartment vacancy rate of less than 1%.
Hmm.
So because that's the case, that doesn't incentivize the landlords, particularly those in the private market,
Yeah.
to set affordable rents,
Yeah.
which is why we really, really need, among many things like rent regulation. But specifically to CORE, we represent tenants, particularly groups of tenants in housing court and other proceedings to ensure that they are paying affordable rents,
Yeah.
that their units and buildings are safe from so many hazards. And I would just wrap this piece up by saying the need is ever increasing. Again, not just because of the ever increasing rents, but it does matter who's in office federally. So we have a new federal administration, and past this prologue, we don't expect to receive additional monies or support for the building or preserving or affordable housing. So while we have so many clients right now that take advantage of our services, I think the need is going to increase, unfortunately, for legal services to keep people in their homes.
Just hearing that, it's very devastating to think about. I feel like a lot of people would feel a bit hopeless, especially learning like that fact. Has there been any talks around legislation or laws that would check landlords and sort of like prevent them from increasing the rent or trying to maybe create more affordable housing units?
The housing conversation is so dense and so complicated because you've got essentially so many players involved in solving some of these problems, or some players that exacerbate the problems. So you have the federal government, you have the state government, and then the city government. Then you have the housing market itself, which is comprised of public and private landlords or developers. So let me just speak very top level and say part of the issue is that we don't have enough of a balance in terms of power between landlords and tenants. So right now, for the most part, it's up to landlords and developers to build their housing and set rents. And even though there's the laws that try to balance it out, it doesn't go far enough. And I'll give you an example. When the tenant pulls out those ads in the paper that say, "Oh, apply for the housing lottery," and and they tell you, how much you can make to get that unit, those are supposed to be based on government intervention, the most affordable units. But even those units are not affordable to the people from our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So to get to your question, I think it is we always have to ensure that we strengthen the existing rent regulation system to ensure that we do have rent caps or even rent rollbacks or freezes. But secondarily, that's not the private market. There's another thought process here to help solve this, and it's an emerging solution.
Mhm.
There's a model called social housing, which in theory essentially gives more power to tenants to become owners of their own units.
Mm.
So in the state of New York, up in Albany, they have two bills called TOPA and COPA. And I'll just talk about TOPA for a second, TOPA,
Mhm.
which stands for the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And what it simply says is before an owner of a large development sells that building to a speculator, which could be someone, abroad even, and to use that for profit, you've got to first give tenants the first right of refusal to buy the building.
Mm.
And so what will happen is the state, assuming it's passed, will set up an authority and have sufficient funds to allow tenants who are renters to, in fact, buy those buildings. And when that happens, and they're going to need very much significant support because buying an older building not only is expensive, but it requires knowledge of maintenance and et cetera.
Mm.
But it's a way of using government power to empower tenants to own their own units.
Mhm.
In other words, it's a social housing model.
Right.
Another example under social housing are what we call a community land trust.
Mhm.
This is a way of allowing local organizations to own those buildings as well, to keep those units affordable in perpetuity. So that side of the coin in terms of social housing is a developing solution to the housing crisis. But government is notoriously slow to bring about these solutions. So it just requires years of pushing
Right.
state lawmakers and electeds to pass some of those laws. So that's an example of laws you can pass to help balance the power out. So there's the rent regulation part, which should be strengthened to ensure that the rents don't keep going up and up and up at crazy amounts every year.
Yeah.
And then there's the public housing model where we actually empower tenants to move toward ownership of their own units to control their own destinies.
That sounds like a really great model and like definitely an alternative solution to just paying, insane amounts for rent each month. And on that
Hmm.
note, I did want to bring up, so in Jumaine Williams' document for the Committee to End Homelessness by the year 2026, kind of one of the big takeaways, and I know you contributed to this document, one of the big takeaways is that in order to address homelessness, like we have to provide like affordable housing. And I think one of the things that stood out to me is that it's actually much cheaper to provide stable, affordable housing to homeless people rather than just having them stay at shelters, which was
Hmm.
very fascinating to me. Do you think that this is like the best approach to kind of tackling the issue of homelessness?
Yes, and let me just say, a part of that document, and I haven't looked at it in a little while, but I know it touched on some of the social services that also should be um, uh, offered with affordable housing units. And there's some housing called supportive housing, which offers folks who needed different services, and it could be mental health counseling or job referral services, etc. We've got to ensure that going forward, we don't allow these crazy rent increases to continue, and that itself creates more homelessness. And there's kind of a guideline that says that a tenant shouldn't or a family shouldn't pay more than about 25 to 30% of their monthly income on rent. And if you do, then you consider rent burdened. There's so many families that are rent burdened that are at risk of becoming homeless. So I see it as two lanes. It's preventing folks from falling into homelessness, and it's trying to house those who are houseless right now. Here's a little something that isn't talked about too much in terms of units. We have a vacancy rate, meaning there are, in fact, units that could hypothetically be used to house those right now who are houses are homeless, perhaps with a voucher like City FEPS voucher or a state FEPS voucher. But it also requires landlords to be open to accepting these vouchers. One huge problem is called the source of income discrimination, meaning a landlord may have it could be a small-ish building or a huge development. These units available, and they're either vacant or we don't know what they're doing with them. There's got to be a way for government, and I get that legally they own the buildings. That's absolutely correct. There's got to be a way for us to figure out how to incentivize uh, the private landlords to open up these units. And speaking of source of income discrimination, by the way, which I've met folks who have these vouchers and who are ready to get an apartment. They'll apply for an apartment, and these are folks living in shelters, by the way, so temporarily homeless, and they apply for apartments, and they're told by the broker or the owner, "We'll get back to you," and they hear nothing back, and it's another form of discrimination. So there's so many problems here with so many solutions, and a part of it is cracking down on landlords who have units right now
Yeah.
and refuse to rent them out because someone is homeless. It's a catch-22,
Right.
and it has to be done. And so that requires the city and the state primarily, but also the feds, to crack down on it. But if we don't know about it, we can't enforce the law.
It is like a double-edged sword. It's like we want to solve the problem and it can at least temporarily be solved, but there is this like unwillingness for whatever reason for landlords not to provide the housing even though it is available.
Yeah.
So I can imagine how difficult it must be to even just like navigate all of that. On that note, I'm wondering like how does New York City itself present unique challenges for addressing homelessness?
I think the average income for a family of three or four, including maybe two kids, is something around 60 or $70,000 for the family. That number alone pretty much isn't enough to pay that $4,000 a month rent. So I think it goes back to what we were discussing earlier. A piece of the solution is strengthening rent regulation. And I will say Albany has passed a few bills, and you mentioned 2018 and 19. They passed the Tenant Protection Act, I think, in 19, to close some of the loopholes which allowed landlords to get units out of rent stabilization. But the state has to be bolder. They have to be bolder, and bolder in those solutions in terms of those rent levels. But let's not let the federal government off the hook either. So there's something called the area median income, or AMIs, and simply said, going back to those ads you see saying apply for the apply for these units through the Housing Connect lottery. Those units are subsidized by the federal government, and how they work it is they'll say, "All right, state of New York and city of New York, we'll give you X hundreds of millions of dollars to subsidize the building and or preserving of these units. In exchange, we're going to attach to that money certain income guidelines. So, for example, the area right now is considered the region. So we have New York City and the surrounding cities. That's the AMI calculation.
Yeah.
What that simply means is that the rents are set at a higher level than the folks in just discrete neighborhoods can afford, because that calculation is regional.
Mm,
And New York City has so many people, and you have such wealth disparities that the AMI gets pushed up in the city. So what I've consistently called for is for the federal government, that's through HUD, the housing agency, to create a either neighborhood based, zip code based, or a calculation that's more localized. Some critics may say, well, yeah, well, that means you may have parts of the Upper West Side not having enough affordable housing. And while that may not be true, none of this will be perfect. But what I do know is we have to have a more localized calculation, so that if a family is from a part of Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, or Harlem, Staten Island, the calculation for those apartments are in fact so localized that you can afford to stay in those units.
right.
Another example, the city. There's something called the Rent Guidelines Board, RGB. And that body is a city body. The mayor appoints, I think, the majority of the board every few years. That's the board that calculates how much rents will either increase, stay the same, or decrease every year. They set those rents for 2 year leases and I think 1 year leases. This is where voting matters, right? So
Mm,
we select the mayor. The mayor appoints the majority of the rent board, and the rent board sets the rent increase, rent freeze, or rent reductions for about 1 million apartments in the city. It's a huge deal. And to give the former administration, de Blasio, credit, even though I worked there for a while, but let me just give them credit. They were able to, if I recall correctly, freeze the rent for 1 or 2 years. And if I remember my facts correct, I think they rolled it back one time. Or if it wasn't a rollback, it was a freeze. I got to go back and look at what years they did what. But that was something that hadn't happened. I don't know when the last time the Rent Guidelines Board froze and or rolled back rent. The current mayor and the current RGB have allowed something like 2 or 3 or 4% increases, or a little bit more, on 1 and 2 year leases, mind you, during and after a pandemic.
mm,
So when we talk about homelessness, it's not always the Democrats, not to be too partisan here, but regardless of party, it doesn't always matter if one party is seen as the ones who are on the side of the working class or the poor, when, sometimes that party is in power and doesn't solve the problem. But the point is, regardless of your political party, you've got to focus on solving people's problems, or they will go elsewhere. It's just a fact.
yeah.
So my hope is that, in the next few years, that our elected officials and our advocates, of which I am now one, from the nonprofit world, really get together and speak about how do we fundamentally reduce costs for folks, including rent.
Yeah.
Food is up, rent is up, and even though the traditional, white ivory tower indicators show that the economy is doing relatively well relative to, compared to what happened a few years ago, and that's a fact. If you don't feel that as a thing, it's hard to believe.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it will take a lot of community organizing and helping one another and kind of relying on one another in order to address the issue at hand.
Yeah.
But is there anything that other states or maybe other countries are doing to address the problem of homelessness that maybe you think could be leveraged to address the crisis in New York City?
Oh, that's interesting, about other cities, states, or countries. Well, earlier how I mentioned the social housing model. While I can't give you a specific other jurisdiction, I know that we did not pioneer this idea, and I know that it's been tried elsewhere. And so I think New York is kind of playing catch up when it comes to where this model comes from, and implementing it. So you actually have given me some homework, which is figuring out, look around after this call and figure out where else has the strains of the social housing model been implemented and successfully. And I will actually, to give you one example, The city has tried it to mixed success, and I'll give you this example of something called um, essentially they're like affordable co-ops. But basically, in the late 80s and early 90s, the city created these housing development fund corporations, HDFCs, which allowed tenants in abandoned buildings to become owners. So we put a bunch of city dollars, taxpayer dollars, into allowing these tenants in abandoned multi-unit buildings to become owners of the buildings. The problem was the city kind of let them down. So when they took over the buildings and got the initial, million, 2 million, whatever million dollars to become owners of the buildings and the units, the city didn't follow through with sufficient support. So when I joined the city arena, I learned about these HDFCs and then learned that there was an issue with, for example, if we own a building, we don't make a bunch of money and the boiler breaks, we're on the hook for that, and the city often wouldn't fund the full repair of those things and say, well, you all owners now, you're on the hook for it. So as we look toward, building this so-called social model, government has to be very clear about the support it will continue to provide to these new owners. And then let's be clear, not everyone wants to be an owner, and that there's no shame in that. For those who want to rent, we ought to also continue to make sure that the rents are affordable. Whether you want to rent or own, it should be affordable either way.
Agreed. Yeah. I think, yeah, presenting people with both opportunities and then they can decide on their own, that seems like the best approach. Also, homelessness in New York City is intertwined with other challenges such as like mental health and inequality. I feel like there is one particular area that needs to be addressed first and foremost, like most urgently.
What I would say needs to happen immediately is a couple of things, and going back to what I talked about earlier in terms of source of income discrimination. We right now have many, many families with vouchers, and they call the council persons, they call the public advocate, they call folks and say, hey, we finally get a voucher, we're excited, and we're stuck in the shelter because our landlords will not rent to us. That is a continuing failure of government to enforce the law. So, Councilmember Gail Brewer, who used to be the borough president and the council person before that, I think she was the one that passed this source of income discrimination law in the first place, maybe 15 or so years ago. And I think she would argue it's a mixed bag of success. And if we don't know about the law, how can we enforce the law? So the city needs to, number one, make make tenants aware that if you have a voucher, it's illegal for a landlord to discriminate. And okay, well, I know that. All right. And here's how you enforce the law. Here's a tool to enforce it. That's a thing that the city could work on the next few months, and I encourage them to do so. It's just they have to enforce the law, the law. And we can write a billion laws, they're only as good as they're enforced. So that alone would I think, if fully enforced, help reduce the homelessness population because you have vouchers and folks can get units. And that's in big developments and even one or two family homes. It's all around the city.
On that note, I guess how do you how do you think that we can balance addressing the issue of homelessness with like the short-term solutions and then more systemic changes?
Yeah, it's a good one. Let me start by saying voting really does matter. And I just want our communities, particularly those who have been neglected by the powers that be for so long, to really ensure that we vet all these candidates, and also this may be, folks might not love this piece, but really look at the forest for the trees. What I think has to happen immediately is for those jurisdictions, and I'm really talking about the cities and states that disagree with the incoming, folks in charge and believe that housing is a human right, use your power to object. Use your power to facilitate the building and preserving of housing that's affordable. The city can do that. And I'll tell you something else that's frustrating. I see housing plan after housing plan after housing plan at the city and state levels. And if I were to ask the average person, including someone obviously who may not have a home, uh, do you think that government's doing enough to solve the housing crisis? The answer is going to be no. And that's a lack of boldness. It's a lack of political will. And people all the time stand up at press conferences and cut ribbons at a great affordable housing building in one district that opens up 60 units. Beautiful. Do you know we need thousands and thousands of units? I think we need something like 600,000 units of housing, affordable housing, to help uh, uh, solve some of this problem. Um, so it's political will. Somebody that I watched when I first got into politics, he was the vice president of the United States. His name was Al Gore. And when he so-called lost that election, he was talking about different changes that need to be made. And he talked about climate change and all this stuff. And he said, these things can be solved with political will, which is renewable. Political will is renewable. And that's on all of us. So pay attention to who you vote on in all these seats, because they set the priority and they set the agenda. And don't put someone in power that doesn't care about people who may have just lost a home or on the streets right now. Those folks exist. So I would just, say we all have a part of solving this problem, but principally elected officials who are elected to use their powers to solve these problems. And it can be done, but we need that renewable resource called political will to do it.
Completely agree. It makes a lot of sense. We all have to play our part. We all play a part in all of this, even if we aren't being affected by it. It is our duty to just get involved in one way or another, because there is strength in numbers, and that's usually how change occurs, and like how change happens is everyone sort of steps in to give a lending hand. And so, as we wrap this up, I do want to ask if you have any advice for young advocates, or just any advocate in general, nonprofits, for creating that long-lasting change.
Yes, this is a really fantastic question. And I don't want to give the corny, like, you got to vote, but we do have to vote, number one. But number two, also realize that we have a lot of voice than we think. So what I would encourage young folks to do is, don't think you've got to wait until you turn X age to start speaking out on these things. There's so many more tools to create change, even than when I was in college, and I'm only 39, about to be 40. So social media has kind of taken over a lot of this. So what I would say is speak out on it, speak out and organize, because the thing that the electeds and others in power don't like is bad press, bad attention. If someone's not doing something to help you, get on social media and talk about it, and do it in an organized way that shows them, oh, these folks are organized. If they can embarrass me, or I can lose an election if I don't respond to them. Let me talk to my city council member and say, hey, talk to me about affordable housing in our district, council person. Don't be afraid to reach out to your elected officials. Even if you didn't vote for them, they still represent you. That's, to me, a really, really big thing for me, because, again, they have the tools to solve this, and they have not, writ large. So that's my biggest advice, which would be use your voice and collectively organize together. By the way, there are organizations like CORE and others that do this work. So email, social media, pick up the phone, just get in touch and say, hey, I'm concerned about housing. What can I do? And we'll talk to you. And our team, we have a policy person who will be happy to talk to folks who want to get involved in this kind of stuff.
Perfect. It sounds really easy to get involved. That's all
It is. It really, really is.
It just
pick up the phone, email, tweet, Instagram. I don't use TikTok too much, but apparently it's the rage. So TikTok, whatever. Like, I don't know.
I mean, it's being banned anyway, but I think that wraps things up. So thank you so much for being here today and just speaking about the issue at hand in depth. I think there was a lot to learn and take away from it.
I tried to break it down to make it like kind of simple, but the housing topic is so hard, but it's doable. It's doable. It's understandable. We can solve these problems. We can.
Thank you again for listening to The Bells I Hear. Subscribe to our podcast and follow Mentor Promise on social media for more.
Special thanks to Alice Obar and Emma Morris, our video editors, and Veritable Mello, our producer.
Song credits to Alegua by Diego Urcola.